Have you ever noticed how often people talk about love, compassion, and caring for others, while rarely being willing to sacrifice anything meaningful to actually help? We live in a world overflowing with inspirational slogans, social media outrage, and empty thoughts and prayers. But real service costs us time, comfort, energy, patience, or resources, and that kind of service has become surprisingly rare. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for Trinity Sunday, we'll explore what genuine service actually looks like. Standing beside imperfect people, doing the exhausting work of peacemaking, and giving something real of ourselves to help sustain our communities. In this episode, we're asking a difficult but deeply practical question. What happens when caring becomes performative instead of sacrificial? Because honestly, it's hard to build healthy families, communities, or societies when everybody wants the appearance of compassion without paying any of the actual cost. So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for Trinity Sunday, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't require belief in the supernatural. These texts were written by pre-scientific people, shaped by their own cultures, needs, and agendas, not as history books or scientific manuals, but as meaning-making stories for their communities. And just like believers approach these writings through the lens of faith, I approach them through a more humanistic lens, one that's grounded in the idea that certain foundational values helped humans evolve and flourish. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, or you might find something completely different. That's the beauty of treating these writings as sacred myth. We're free to negotiate with the text and discover whatever insights we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for Trinity Sunday, Cycle A. Our first reading is from the book of Exodus. It's chapter 34, verses 4b through 6, and verses 8 and 9. Our second reading is from 2 Corinthians. It's chapter 13, verses 11 through 13. And our gospel reading is from John. It's chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. Now we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings. Then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one. Finally, we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. And with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from the book of Exodus. Moses went up Mount Sinai early in the morning, as the Lord had commanded him, and he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Moses bowed to the ground at once and worshipped. Lord, he said, if I have found favor in your eyes, then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin, and take us as your inheritance. Our second reading is from the second letter to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, rejoice, strive for full restoration, encourage one another, be of one mind, live in peace. And the God of love and peace will be with you. Greet one another with a holy kiss. All God's people here send their greetings. May the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all. And our gospel reading is from John. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. All right, so let's go back and take a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from Exodus, and this reading comes right after one of the greatest disasters in the Hebrew Bible, the golden calf incident. Moses has barely come down from the mountain before the community completely falls apart into fear, impatience, and chaos. And honestly, that feels pretty realistic. Human beings are messy. Communities are messy. Families, workplaces, friendships, churches, governments, none of them function perfectly for very long because people themselves are imperfect. What stands out in this story is not the supernatural spectacle or divine wrath. What really stood out for me was the idea of remaining committed to a flawed community instead of abandoning it in the moment it disappoints you. Moses stayed committed to the community and advocated for it. Moses steps into the role of advocate. He argues for patience, for mercy, and continued support for people who clearly had some problems. Now, traditionally, this story is framed in theological language about sin and forgiveness, but underneath all of that religious stuff is a deeply human truth. Service often means standing beside people during their worst moments instead of just walking away in frustration. Now, that doesn't mean enabling harmful behavior or pretending accountability doesn't matter. Healthy communities absolutely need boundaries and consequences. But service requires more than just judgment. Service requires some amount of endurance. It asks whether we're willing to help repair people and communities instead of simply condemning them from a distance. And honestly, this may be one of the places where modern society struggles the most. We live in a culture that is increasingly transactional. People, they can become inconvenient, too difficult, politically uncomfortable, or emotionally exhausting, or socially embarrassing. And when that happens, lots of folks these days, they just cut ties and move on. Now, sometimes that separation, what's necessary? Sometimes it's healthy, but sometimes it's just that we've lost the ability to patiently work through imperfection with one another. Social media especially trains us to see human beings as disposable once they fail whatever purity test we're using at the moment. The fact is that real service is usually not very glamorous. It often looks like staying engaged, offering guidance, helping people grow, refusing to give up on human beings too quickly. Real service begins when we stop expecting perfection from people and instead choose to support, guide, and advocate for one another anyway. So the main lesson I got from our first reading is that service means standing by people when life gets messy. One of the most important forms of service is advocacy, choosing to care enough about people and communities that we work to support them even when they are struggling or flawed or frustrating. That kind of service, it takes patience. It takes emotional maturity. It takes a willingness to see human beings as works in progress instead of just seeing them as permanent failures. That kind of service pushes us beyond shallow kindness and into something deeper and more demanding, which is the daily work of helping hold our communities together when they start to fracture. Service means standing by people when life gets messy. Our second reading was from the second letter to the Corinthians, and this short passage from Corinthians is surprisingly practical once you strip away the religious language surrounding it. Paul encourages the community to repair divisions, to support one another, to seek agreement. He encourages them to live in peace. And honestly, that sounds less like abstract theology and more like advice for surviving group projects or family gatherings or online communities or workplaces or neighborhood associations. It sounds very practical across a broad array of situations. Human beings have always struggled with conflict, with personal ego getting in the way, with resentment and tribalism. Yeah, over time, the technology changes, the clothing changes, the arguments on social media become more obnoxious, that's for sure, but the underlying human problems, they stay remarkably consistent. What makes this passage interesting is that it frames peace as active work rather than some sort of passive niceness. Healthy communities don't magically appear because people say they value love or unity. Relationships require work. They require maintenance. Misunderstandings have to be addressed. Harm has to be repaired. Trust has to be rebuilt after conflict. And that work is exhausting sometimes. It's a hell of a lot easier to stay angry, to retreat into our ideological corners, or just quietly cut people out of our lives. It's a lot easier to do that than it is to patiently work through disagreement. Yet service often looks exactly like that difficult emotional labor, the willingness to mend fractures before they become permanent breaks. And this is where the contrast between practical human service and religious metaphysical obsession becomes especially noticeable. Trinity Sunday, historically, became heavily focused on debates about the nature of God. 3 persons, 1 substance, eternal generation, procession, heresies, councils, creeds, centuries of arguments that most ordinary people, they don't understand them and they don't benefit from them in their daily lives. All of this theoretical, theological, supernatural arguing is going on for centuries. Meanwhile, the actual communities hearing these letters or reading these letters from Paul, guess what? They still needed food and support. They needed help with conflict resolution. They needed more compassion. They needed to learn cooperation. People still needed help learning how to live together without destroying one another. In many ways, that practical work of maintaining healthy human relationships matters far more to everyday flourishing than theological hair-splitting ever did. Service is not only about helping individuals in moments of crisis. Service is also the ongoing work of building healthier, more peaceful communities together. So the main lesson I got from our second reading is that service means doing the hard work of peace. One of the most overlooked forms of service is the effort required to create and sustain healthy relationships and communities. Peacemaking is not weakness, avoidance, or pretending conflict doesn't exist. Peacemaking is the difficult work of listening carefully, repairing harm, building a common floor, and just refusing to let resentment permanently poison our connections with one another. Healthy communities survive because people intentionally invest energy into cooperation and understanding and restoration. That kind of service may not always receive attention or even praise, but without it, communities slowly fall apart. Service means doing the hard work of peace. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of John, and this reading included the famous John 3:16, probably one of the most quoted verses in the entire Bible. Unfortunately, it's often reduced to a theological slogan about belief and salvation. Entire branches of Christianity have built massive systems around getting people to say the correct words, accept the correct doctrine, and hold the correct supernatural beliefs about Jesus. But if we step back from all of the dogma for a moment, the emotional core of the passage points towards something a lot more practical and a lot more human. Love that gives something of itself for the benefit of others. That's it. The story frames care for the world, not as a feeling or an abstract idea, but as a very costly action for someone. And honestly, that is where service becomes difficult. Most people support generosity, in theory. Most people love the idea of compassion, kindness, or helping others, as long as it remains reasonably convenient. But real service usually costs us something. It costs time, energy, attention, comfort, money, emotional labor, opportunity, sometimes personal security. Look, parents sacrifice sleep, freedom, and resources for their children. Caregivers sacrifice emotional energy for aging family members. Activists sacrifice comfort to confront injustice. Teachers, nurses, social workers, volunteers, community organizers, they often give enormous amounts of themselves while receiving very little recognition in return. Genuine care becomes visible through what we are actually willing to give. And this is where the passage can become surprisingly powerful when it's separated from religious exclusivity. Historically, this verse has sometimes been used less as an invitation into love and more as a threat about eternal punishment for people who fail to believe the correct things. Entire theological systems shifted the focus away from tangible human flourishing and shifted it toward fear-based questions about heaven, hell, and doctrinal loyalty. But the deeper human lesson here is far more grounded. If we truly care about humanity, then that concern must become visible in our actions. Love that never feeds anyone, never protects anyone, never comforts anyone, never teaches anyone, never sacrifices for anyone. Love like that eventually becomes little more than performance, thoughts and prayers. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that service means giving more than words. One of the clearest measures of our values is what we are willing to contribute to the well-being of others. Real service moves beyond slogans, identity labels, inspirational quotes, or abstract beliefs, and enters that difficult territory of personal sacrifice and tangible action. Real service asks us to consider not just what we claim to care about, but what we consistently invest ourselves in. Healthy communities survive because ordinary people choose to give their time, skills, compassion, and resources to help sustain one another. And in a world filled with performative outrage and all this shallow virtue signaling, quietly showing up and contributing something real, that may be one of the most meaningful acts of love that's available to us. Service means giving more than words. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Exodus, the main lesson I came away with was service means standing by people when life gets messy. In our second reading from 2 Corinthians, the main lesson I got was service means doing the hard work of peace. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was service means giving more than words. service is so much bigger than random acts of kindness or occasional charity. It's the ongoing decision to stay invested in one another, even when people are imperfect, and relationships get difficult, or communities feel fractured and frickin' exhausting. It means helping repair what's broken instead of just walking away from it. It means contributing to peace instead of constantly escalating the conflict. And it means understanding that real care always costs us something. Our time, patience, energy, comfort, resources. It takes emotional effort. Human flourishing has never depended on isolated individuals competing for survival. Our flourishing has always depended on ordinary people choosing to support, protect, teach, encourage, forgive, and sacrifice for one another. And in a culture that's just obsessed with self-interest and status and personal convenience, choosing to genuinely serve other human beings may be one of the most powerful ways we remind ourselves what community is actually supposed to look like. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what? And now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, I think we should care because service directly challenges the tribalism that is poisoning modern society. Far too many religious and political communities have become obsessed with defending their own group while ignoring the suffering of everyone who's outside of their boundaries. But if service only applies to people who look like us, or vote like us, or worship like us, or agree with us, then it's not really service at all. It's just favoritism, pretending to be morality. Real service pushes us to see humanity first and reminds us that communities survive when people care for one another beyond the limits of tribe, ideology, and identity. This is important because the world doesn't improve through slogans or hashtags or performative outrage. We live in a culture that's overflowing with thoughts and prayers and inspirational quotes and online virtue signaling, while millions of people still struggle with poverty, homelessness, loneliness, addiction, lack of access to health care or education. Good intentions matter, but they are not enough by themselves. Real service asks uncomfortable questions. What are we actually willing to give? What inconvenience are we willing to endure? What sacrifice are we willing to make so somebody else can live with greater dignity and more stability? We should care about this because modern culture has become frighteningly disposable. People make mistakes. They say the wrong thing. They struggle emotionally. They fail publicly, or they hold imperfect views, and suddenly entire crowds are ready to cast them aside forever. Now, accountability absolutely matters. Harm matters. But there is a difference between accountability and permanent social exile. Healthy communities can't exist if nobody is allowed to grow, repair damage, or become better over time. I don't know about you, but I do not want to be eternally judged by my worst moment or the dumbest thing I've ever done. Service sometimes means standing beside imperfect people while they struggle to rebuild themselves, instead of treating them like broken things that just need to be discarded. These lessons are important because peacemaking is one of the most important and exhausting forms of service in a deeply divided society. Peace is not passive avoidance. It's not pretending injustice doesn't exist. Real peace requires difficult conversations, It demands emotional maturity. Sometimes it requires compromise, listening, repair, and the willingness to bridge divides that powerful people often profit from keeping wide. Communities do not heal themselves automatically. Right? Families don't just magically reconcile. Social trust does not rebuild itself by accident. Somebody has to do the work. And the future of any healthy society depends on whether enough people are willing to step forward and serve in that way. Somebody has to do the work. Are you willing to be somebody? And the last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Well, look, one of the easiest things in the world is to care about problems emotionally while never actually changing our behavior in response to those problems. Now, most people genuinely do care about suffering, injustice, loneliness, struggling families, or broken communities. But caring in theory and contributing in practice, those are two very different things. It is incredibly easy to convince ourselves that good intentions are enough, because real service almost always costs us something. Time, money, energy, convenience, emotional effort, or personal comfort. So, with that in mind, here's your question for the week. Where in my life are good intentions replacing meaningful action? This question matters because it forces us to honestly examine the gap between what we say we value and how we actually spend our time, energy, and resources. And that gap affects almost every area of our lives. Maybe there's a relationship you keep saying you want to repair, but you never initiate that difficult conversation. And maybe there's a social issue that you care deeply about. You truly care about it. But you've never taken even one small practical step to help. Maybe somebody close to you is struggling emotionally, financially, physically, and you keep hoping things improve without really showing up for them in a concrete way. Growth often begins when we stop measuring ourselves by our intentions and start measuring ourselves by our actions. You know, one of the things I've learned about myself over the years is that I actually need fairly strong boundaries in my life. When I was younger, I said yes to way too many things and ended up overextending myself, trying to do just everything that popped up. Over time, I realized that wasn't healthy and it definitely wasn't sustainable. So these days, I'm generally pretty careful about protecting my time, my energy, my commitments. I care deeply about people, but I also know that I can't solve every problem or carry every burden. But every once in a while, life presents you with a moment where the normal rules just really don't apply. About 1.5 years ago, my nephew died from suicide. At the time, my wife and I were still living in Virginia while the rest of the family was in Michigan. My brother called me that morning. He was completely devastated. Later, my parents told me that in the middle of all the chaos and grief, I was the first person he wanted to talk to. Honestly, at that moment, I didn't spend any time at all weighing the pros and cons or trying to optimize my schedule. I wrapped up a few things, immediately got in the car the next morning and drove to Michigan. I stayed for a few weeks because my family needed me there. Now, the thing is, I didn't have some magical solution. I couldn't fix what had happened. None of us could. I couldn't take the pain away. Shit, most of the time, I didn't even know what to say. But I learned something very important during that period. Sometimes helping others isn't about having the perfect words or being able to offer some sage advice. It definitely wasn't about being the hero who swoops in and saves the day. Sometimes service, helping others and giving back, just means rearranging your life long enough to help carry unbearable weight with the people you love. It means showing up consistently. It means entering those metaphorical locked rooms that I talked about last week. Those locked rooms where people can find themselves emotionally trapped inside of, and just sitting with other human beings and refusing to let them suffer alone. That experience also helped me understand something else. Healthy boundaries and sacrificial service, they're not opposites. Boundaries matter. They protect us from burnout, resentment, and losing ourselves in other people's problems. But there are also moments in life when love asks something costly of us. Moments when another person's pain becomes more important than our routines or our convenience or our comfort, at least for a while. And I think part of becoming a mature, compassionate human being is learning the wisdom to recognize the difference between those ordinary situations where boundaries are necessary and those extraordinary moments where showing up fully for somebody else is exactly what love and service require. So, spend some time with our question. Where in my life are good intentions replacing meaningful action? The goal here is not to guilt trip yourself. It's not about self-condemnation. Nobody can solve every problem or help every person. The goal here is simply to identify one area where your actions could become more aligned with your values. Real service doesn't always require grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like consistently checking on a friend who's struggling with something. It could be volunteering a few hours or mentoring someone younger. It could be something as simple as helping a neighbor, donating intentionally, or finally stepping into a difficult but necessary conversation with someone else. Small acts of meaningful service, repeated consistently over time, are often what quietly hold families, friendships, and entire communities together. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. American writer-philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote, "Rings and jewels are not gifts, but apologies for gifts. The only true gift is a portion of thyself." I think Emerson was pointing towards something deeply uncomfortable, but deeply important about service and generosity. It is relatively easy to give away excess money, to offer quick advice, to repost something, to say thoughts and prayers, or make vague statements about caring for people. Sometimes those things do have value, but Emerson argues that real giving involves something a lot more personal. Genuine service requires us to invest part of our actual lives into the well-being of other people. If you're a teacher, you give your knowledge and patience. If you're a builder, you give your skill and labor. If you're a good listener, you give your presence, your emotional energy. Real service costs something because it involves giving away part of yourself that you can't fully get back. And that's a good thing. That's what makes this week's question so important. It pushes us to examine whether our values are showing up in concrete ways or if they're staying trapped in the safe world of good intentions and abstract compassion. Are we helping in ways that genuinely require our time, attention, effort, or sacrifice? Or are we mostly offering leftovers that cost us very little? That doesn't mean that every act of service has to be some dramatic or life-altering thing. Sometimes giving a portion of yourself just means consistently showing up for another person, offering your skills where they're needed, or just being emotionally present when somebody else is struggling. And honestly, I think that kind of service, that's what holds human communities together, a lot more than grand speeches or public performances ever will. The people who quietly give portions of themselves, whether it's through care, labor, patience, mentoring, listening, teaching, building, protecting, supporting, those are often the people who are really the ones sustaining our families and our friendships and our neighborhoods and our communities, and they're doing it quietly every single day. Emerson reminds us that the most meaningful forms of generosity, they're not transactional. They're relational. They're human. And they ask something real from each one of us. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week, but in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across, wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for Trinity Sunday, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that choosing to genuinely serve other human beings may be one of the most powerful ways we remind ourselves what community is actually supposed to look like. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV. Copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, and 2011 by Biblica Inc. Used by permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Thank you again for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. More people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find the podcast at thecodaproject.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.